So we've left the pharaohs of the Old Kingdom, and now we'll look at some monuments for New Kingdom leaders. And we'll start here with the stele of Akhenaten. And Akhenaten is an unusual leader, as many of the New Kingdom leaders are. But you'll notice the one thing that we often talk about is how there's no use of canon or proportion here. So people discuss how he was breaking with the accepted way that Egyptian art would have looked. So that's a big, significant change that you see. And people say, well, why did he do this? He did it, we believe, because he changed the worship system of Egypt also at this time. Egyptians were polytheists. They worshipped many gods. Polytheism, poly, many, theism, gods, right? Religion. So they were polytheists. They had Ra, they had Osiris, they had Anubis, they had Hathor. You can go on and on. They had a lot of gods. What Akhenaten did actually is he changed the worship to the god Aten. And the god Aten was the sun disk. So the sun disk, as you see it in the sky, you'll see the rays coming down towards them. And you might say, well, it's a sun god then. Well, be careful, because Ra was the sun god. This is something different. This is the Aten. If you're wondering how it's spelled, right, Aten, it's the last four letters of Akhenaten's name. He actually had changed his name from Amenhotep to Akhenaten. And Amon, by the way, Amen, related to Amon-Ra, or the sun god, he changes his name to relate to the Aten, Aten. So we think that the style change from the canon of proportions was probably also linked to this religious change. And I can't state enough how bizarre it really was for him to do this, because he changes them from a system that had been in place for thousands of years. Egyptians were nothing if not consistent, by the way. They did the same thing for thousands of years. You have to consider this. The canon of proportion, 3,000 years. So these were pretty conservative people about change. They didn't like to change. So he makes them change from a polytheistic system, right, to a monotheistic system, because the Aten is the only god he says they can worship. So they become monotheists. Mono means one. That's it, right? Not polytheists. And he also changes, we believe, the way the art looks to mirror, right, that change. And long story short, this does not go over well. And he is ousted from power. Nefertiti is also related to Akhenaten, so you see her here as well. And she's often referenced as like the most beautiful, queen of Egypt and all these other things. But you'll notice she wears this blue crown that relates her to the Aten worship. You also see it in the stele piece as well. And you'll notice that this is an unfinished work. And just to give you a sense of, how we view art, this was actually found in the trash in Thutmose's studio, the artist who made it. So funny enough, one of the most beautiful pieces of art was actually in the trash. So just a funny aside about that. And King Tut comes after Akhenaten, and most people know him, because of his grave goods, his grave that we find. But I wanted to be clear, he's really not that important of a ruler. He's actually what we consider a very minor ruler. And he's often called the boy king because he died so young. He died at like age 18, around in that area. Obviously, I'm not sure of the exact age, but he was very, very young when he died. Notice that he changes his name from the Aten designation back to the Amon-Ra designation. Amen is the end of his name. So he defies his uncle's. He was thought to be his uncle for some time. Now we think that perhaps Akhenaten was actually his father. But he defies his family's decision about the Aten worship and goes back to the Amon-Ra worship. So Tut knows that the people of Egypt prefer the old ways. So he goes back to them. But again, we mainly know him for his tomb. So thinking about that Egyptian I live to die idea, Tut's tomb is a great place to look at an untouched tomb. As I had mentioned previously, 99% of tombs are looted. So it is a very big problem. Most excavators of tombs don't find much. When Howard Carter was excavating this tomb, it was unspoiled. And the reason why is that there had been a rock slide that covered this tomb up, and another tomb was built on top of it. And so when the tomb raiders came, they took the top tomb's grave goods, not Tut's grave goods. So a bit of luck for Tut that he was forgotten for being such a minor ruler, and great luck for us because, again, we get to see these things today as art historians and archaeologists. So, and there's a story about when Howard Carter drills a hole in the door that had not been opened since Tut's time and looks in, and his people are saying to him, "What do you see?" And he says, "All manner of wonderful things." And but I wanted to point out, if you look at this diagram, you might notice it looks like kind of a crazy garage sale in there. This is because Tut died very young, as I mentioned, and they had to rush his tomb, and they had to steal somebody else's tomb and shove all his stuff in there. So again, just another funny story about someone that people go, "Oh, Tut, he was so popular and amazing." No, not really, right? We just have all this stuff. So we get really excited about it. And on the left, you actually have photographs from when they opened the tomb. So you notice how jumbled and crazy it is in there, as they shove all the stuff in there. And notice, even though he went back to Amun-Ra worship, notice that he had a throne that looks like Aten worship. So some things take a little bit of time to get away from. And I always just speak a little bit to mummification here. Here you see Anubis, right, who was the right-hand man of Osiris, preparing a body. And, we look a lot to the mummification of the Egyptians to understand their culture, how much they believed that they went on into the afterlife. So here you have some imagery related to how the body would have preserved with natron, with the salt mixture, and dried out basically and prepared for mummification. Once the body was dried out with the salt or the natron, it would be anointed with oils and wrapped, and your Book of the Dead would be included and your amulets for protection. The last image I wanted to show you just briefly was the Temple of Ramses II at Abu Simbel, and he's the last pharaoh I wanted to show you. So you'll notice by the end of the Egyptian period that the mentality behind pharaohs had gotten quite grandiose. Here's Ra in the middle, right, and the pharaoh is way, way bigger than him. So it shows you that the pharaoh's egos became very outsized, right, as they got older. By the way, this whole temple had to be moved when the Aswan Dam was built. It had to literally be cut apart and moved piece by piece, or the flooding would have erased it, right? So it's a fun story to consider how this temple had to be preserved.